Hello. This is Moonlit Inc. BL. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Scent of Silence. The bell above the door chimed with a familiar, thin metallic ring, but the air that followed it into the shop was anything but ordinary. Andrew Baltimore didn't look up from the shears in his hand. He was busy trimming the thorns off a dozen white roses, his movements methodical and calm. His shop, the verdant nook, was a sliver of peace squeezed between the frantic grinding of a coffee roaster next door and the dusty, hushed silence of the bookstore on his left. He loved it here. The air usually smelled of damp earth, sweet pollen, and the faint, toasted scent of espresso drifting through the vents. As a recessive alpha, Andrew lived in a world of muted colors. To most of society, he was a ghost. He had the physical blueprint of a dominant male, the towering height, the shoulders that strained against his linen apron, and a jawline that could have been carved from granite, but he lacked the radio station to broadcast it. He gave off no scent. He didn't react to the cloying, sugary pheromones of omegas in heat, nor did he feel the instinctive urge to snarl at other alphas. He was, for all intents and purposes, a beta with a high-definition skin. And he preferred it that way. "I'll be with you in a moment," Andrew said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Take your time." The voice was like velvet dragged over gravel. It carried a weight that made the air in the small shop feel suddenly pressurized. Andrew finally looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt a physical reaction to another person. It wasn't the biological pull he'd read about in textbooks, it was a prickly, static sensation crawling across his skin, like the air right before a lightning strike. Standing by the bucket of sunflowers was a man who seemed too large for the room. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Andrew's entire inventory. His hair was dark, his eyes a piercing, predatory gold, and his presence was suffocating. This was Marvin Howell. An enigma. To anyone else, Marvin's scent, strong black coffee and crushed pine, would be a physical blow. It was a scent designed to dominate alphas and drive omegas into a submissive frenzy. Andrew just blinked, his nose twitching slightly at the prickle. "Can I help you find something?" Andrew asked, setting the shears down. "A gift? Or perhaps something for an office?" Marvin didn't answer immediately. He was staring at Andrew with an expression that shifted from casual boredom to sharp, narrowed intensity. He took a deliberate step forward, invading Andrew's personal space. Most people would be trembling or baring their teeth by now. Andrew just stood there, his expression flat, his gray eyes showing nothing but mild professional curiosity. "You're an alpha," Marvin stated. It wasn't a question. He was reading the bone structure, the height, the way Andrew held his ground. Andrew replied dryly, turning back to his roses. "I'm just a florist. If you're looking to intimidate someone, the gym is 2 blocks down. If you want flowers, the tulips are on sale." Marvin's eyebrows shot up. He moved closer, his scent flaring, a deliberate pulse of power intended to make Andrew's knees buckle. The pine scent turned sharp, almost resinous. Andrew felt the static on his arms get a little louder. He rubbed his forearm absently. "Is there a gas leak? You're making my skin itch." Marvin froze. He looked at Andrew as if he were a statue that had suddenly started reciting poetry. He had never met a scentless person who looked like this. Usually, betas were soft-featured, and recessive alphas were sickly or frail. But the man in front of him was a physical masterpiece of the alpha phenotype, yet he was reacting to an enigma's pheromones as if they were a mild allergy. "What is your name?" Marvin asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Andrew," he replied, not offering a surname. He hadn't used Baltimore since the day his father told him he was a disgrace to their lineage. "Are you going to buy something, or are you just here to breathe heavily in my shop?" A slow, dangerous smirk spread across Marvin's face. He reached out, his fingers brushing a petal of a white rose, but his eyes never left Andrew's. "I think," Marvin murmured, "I'll take the roses. All of them." Andrew sighed, reaching for the brown packing paper. He didn't see the way Marvin was watching the flex of his shoulders. He didn't see the hunger in the enigma's eyes. Andrew only wanted the man to pay and leave so he could go back to his quiet, scentless world. He didn't realize that for an Enigma, a man who couldn't be conquered was the only man worth chasing. Chapter 2, The Relentless Pursuit. The second time Marvin Howell entered the verdant nook, he didn't come alone. He brought the smell of a storm, sharp, electric, and smelling of deep woods, and a cup of expensive coffee that he set unceremoniously on Andrew's workbench. Guatemalan roast, Marvin said, leaning against the counter. His tailored suit was a deep navy today, making his golden eyes look almost metallic. Black. No sugar. I figured a man who spends his day around floral scents would appreciate something grounded. Andrew looked at the cup, then at the man. He was currently elbow-deep in a shipment of baby's breath, his large hands moving with a delicate precision that seemed to fascinate the Enigma. "I have a coffee shop next door, Mr. Howell," Andrew said, his voice flat. "I'm well caffeinated." "Marvin," the Enigma corrected. "And the shop next door doesn't serve this. Besides, they don't deliver it with a conversation." "I'm not for sale, and neither is my time," Andrew replied, finally looking up. He didn't flinch at the proximity. Up close, Marvin was a gravitational force. His pheromones were a thick, invisible velvet, pressing against Andrew's skin like a physical weight. To any other alpha, this would be a challenge to a fight. To an omega, it would be a command to kneel. To Andrew, it just felt like a humid afternoon. He wiped his hands on his apron, the fabric straining across his broad chest. "Why are you here? You bought every rose in the shop yesterday. Surely they haven't wilted yet." "I gave them away," Marvin said, his gaze dropping to Andrew's throat, where a faint pulse beat steady and calm. "To my secretary, the concierge, the barista. I just wanted the excuse to see if you'd look as unimpressed today as you did yesterday." Andrew felt a flicker of annoyance. He had spent 10 years carving out this quiet life. After his parents had looked at his scentless blood tests with disgust and wiped the Baltimore name from his records, he had found peace in being a nobody. He was a ghost in a world of screaming biology. He didn't want to be a curiosity for an Enigma who was bored with his own power. "I'm very consistent," Andrew said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wedding bouquet to finish." But Marvin didn't leave. For the next week, he became a fixture. He showed up at 10 a.m. with coffee. He showed up at 4 p.m. with rare books from the shop next door, placing them near Andrew like offerings. He watched Andrew work, his silence heavy and observant. He was courting Andrew with the calculated intensity of a hunter, but Andrew treated him like a particularly stubborn piece of furniture. "You're wasting your time," Andrew said on the 5th day, as he tied a silk ribbon around a bundle of lavender. "I'm a recessive alpha, Marvin. I don't have the parts you're looking for. I don't go into heat, I don't produce a scent that will please you, and I certainly don't care about your status." Marvin's eyes darkened, a flash of something primal flickering in the amber depths. He stepped around the counter, entering the workspace Andrew considered his sanctuary. "Do you think I'm here because of your biology?" Marvin's voice was a low vibration that Andrew felt in his teeth. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of Andrew's sharp jaw. Andrew didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He remained a pillar of stone. "Everyone else in this city looks at me and sees a crown or a predator," Marvin whispered, his crushed pine scent flaring so strongly that Andrew's skin actually began to sting. "They react to what I am. But you? You just see a man who's in your way. It's the most intoxicating thing I've ever felt." Andrew met his gaze, his gray eyes cold. "I grew up being cherished for what I was supposed to be, and then discarded when I wasn't. I don't care about being intoxicating to you. I want a quiet life. I want to smell my flowers, not your ego." He stepped back, breaking the contact. The rejection was sharp, physical. For a moment, Marvin looked stunned. No one had ever spoken to him with such utter lack of fear. The bell chimed, breaking the tension. A young, flashy omega, Shen, strutted in, his scent of cloyingly sweet lilies preceded him. He headed straight for Marvin, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Andrew. "Marvin, darling," Shen purred, ignoring Andrew entirely. I heard you were frequenting a flower shop. I didn't realize you were spending so much time with the help. Andrew didn't even look up. He just picked up his shears and went back to work, the silence of his defective biology feeling more like a shield than it ever had before. Chapter 3, The Obsessed Omega. The air in the shop, which had been thick with the resinous, heavy scent of Marvin's presence, suddenly curdled. Shen stepped further into the light, his silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to radiate a cloying, sugary wave of lilies. It was a scent designed to trigger protective instincts in alphas, a high-pitched floral scream for attention. Andrew didn't blink. To him, it just smelled like someone had spilled a bottle of cheap perfume in a dumpster. Shen, Marvin said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. He didn't move toward the Omega. In fact, he stepped closer to Andrew's workbench, a subtle territorial shift that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I don't recall giving you my schedule. Shen's lip curled as he looked at Andrew. He took in the dirt under Andrew's fingernails, the plain cotton of his apron, and the lack of any discernible pheromonal response. I was just surprised. Usually, you have better taste than domestic help. This one doesn't even have a scent. Is he a beta, or just broken? Andrew paused, his shears hovering over a stem of eucalyptus. The word broken echoed in his head, a ghost of his father's voice from a decade ago. A Baltimore who can't command a room is a broken tool, Andrew. You're a waste of good blood. He looked up, his gray eyes flat and unreadable. I'm a florist, Andrew said calmly. And if you aren't here to buy an arrangement, you're blocking the light for the succulents. They're more sensitive than they look. Shen gasped, his scent turning sharp and acidic with pique. How dare you speak to me like? He's right, Marvin interrupted, his golden eyes flashing with a predatory light that made Sloane stumble back a step. You're making the air unpleasant, Shen. And you're interrupting my conversation. Conversation? Shen laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. Marvin, look at him. He's a dull, scentless wall. He can't give you what an Enigma needs. He can't even go into heat. He's a biological dead end. You're an Enigma, you need someone who can match your fire, not a man who treats you like a common customer. Andrew felt a familiar, hollow ache. He had spent his entire life being told he was a dead end. He had accepted it. He had built a fortress out of petals and thorns specifically to avoid people like Shen, people who saw human beings as nothing more than a collection of glands and hormones. I'm not a fire to be put out, Shen, Marvin said, his voice vibrating with a power that made the glass vases on the shelves rattle. And Andrew is the only person in this city who looks at me without wanting something from my bloodline. Now, get out. Before I make it so you can't smell lilies for a month. Shen turned pale, his sugary scent vanishing under a wave of pure, unadulterated fear. He threw one last venomous look at Andrew, a look of pure, concentrated hatred, before spinning on his heel and fleeing the shop. The silence that followed was heavy. The static on Andrew's skin had intensified, a prickling heat that made his hands shake slightly. He hated this. He hated being the center of a biological tug-of-war. Andrew, Marvin started, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He reached out, but Andrew pulled his hand away before contact could be made. He's right, you know, Andrew said, not looking up. I am a dead end. I don't have ruts. I don't have a scent. I don't fit into the world you live in. You're a Howell, Marvin. You're supposed to be at the top of the food chain, and I'm just here. I don't care about the food chain, Marvin countered, stepping around the counter again. I do, Andrew snapped, finally showing a spark of the alpha temper buried deep within him. Because when people like you come into my world, you bring people like him. You bring noise and status and pheromones. I worked very hard to be nobody. Please. Just take your coffee and go. Marvin watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the Enigma looked genuinely pained. He didn't push. He simply nodded, picked up his coffee, and walked out. Andrew stood alone in his shop, the prickling on his skin disappeared as the Enigma left. The smell of crushed pine fading, replaced by the cool, indifferent scent of wet earth. He should have felt relieved. Instead, for the first time in years, the quiet felt a little too quiet. Chapter 4, The Request. The following week was the quietest Andrew had known in months, yet it was the loudest his head had ever been. He threw himself into his work, over-trimming hydrangeas and reorganizing the seedling wall until his fingers were stained a deep green. He told himself he was glad the Enigma was gone. He told himself that the static on his skin was just a seasonal allergy. Then came the rain, a torrential, gray downpour that turned the street into a blurred watercolor. The bell above the door didn't just chime, it rattled against the glass as the door was flung open. A blast of cold air and the smell of ozone flooded the shop, but it was instantly drowned out by something much more violent. Marvin stood in the doorway, and for a moment, Andrew didn't recognize him. The composed, predatory Enigma in the charcoal suits was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his skin was a terrifying, waxy pale. But it was the scent that hit Andrew first. It wasn't the prickle of before. It was a roar. The crushed pine had turned into a forest fire, the black coffee was now a bitter, scorched earth. It was a scent that demanded submission, a biological command so loud it made the windows of the shop vibrate in their frames. Andrew, Marvin gasped. He lunged forward, catching himself on the edge of the mahogany counter. His hands were shaking so violently that a vase of daisies tipped over, water spilling across the floor. Marvin? What happened? Are you hurt? Andrew moved instinctively, his alpha instincts, dormant as they were, flickering to life at the sight of another in pain. Rut, Marvin choked out. He looked up, and his eyes were no longer gold, they were a dark, burning amber, the pupils blown wide. It's an Enigma, Rut. It's not like yours. It's not a fever. It's a collapse. He slumped against the counter, his breathing ragged and wet. I tried to get to my estate. My driver. I couldn't let anyone near me. They'd break. Their biology, they'd just break under the pressure. But you. Marvin reached out, his fingers catching the sleeve of Andrew's apron. His touch was burning hot, like he was literal coal. You don't smell me. You don't bow. Please. Just one night. I have nowhere else to hide where I won't hurt someone. Andrew looked at the man. In this state, Marvin wasn't a powerful Enigma or a wealthy heir. He was a creature in agony, his own biology turning against him in a violent surge of power that had nowhere to go. An Enigma's rut was a biological supernova. If he stayed in a public place or with an omega, he would trigger a pheromonal chain reaction that could end in a riot or worse. Andrew was the only dead end in the city. He was the only one who could stand in the middle of this storm and not be swept away. The back room, Andrew said, his voice dropping into a steady command. He hooked an arm under Marvin's shoulder. The heat radiating off the Enigma was staggering, nearly 104 degrees by Andrew's guess. I have a cot and a sink. Move, Marvin. Now. Marvin groaned, leaning his entire weight into Andrew. As they stumbled toward the curtained-off living space behind the shop, Marvin's nose pressed into the crook of Andrew's neck. He let out a low, broken sound, half sob, half growl. Nothing, Marvin whispered into Andrew's skin, his voice delirious. You smell like nothing. It's so quiet. Please, don't let me go. Andrew laid him down on the narrow cot, the room instantly filling with the suffocating, heavy scent of the Enigma's distress. For the first time in his life, Andrew felt a bead of sweat roll down his own spine. It wasn't because he was attracted, it was because the air was so thick with Marvin's pheromones that it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I'm staying, Andrew said, wetting a cloth with cool water. I'm right here. It's just one night. He didn't know then that, one night, would be the end of the man he used to be. Chapter 5, The Overload. The air in the tiny back room of the flower shop turned into a physical weight. It wasn't just a smell anymore, it was a tide. Marvin's Enigma rut was a biological meltdown, a violent release of pheromones so potent they seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the single overhead bulb. Andrew knelt by the cot, wringing out a cold cloth for the fourth time. His own heart was hammering against his ribs, not with desire, but with a primal, systemic alarm. His body, which had spent 28 years in a state of quiet stasis, was suddenly being bombarded by a frequency it wasn't built to handle. "Easy, Marvin," Andrew steadied him, his large hands pinning the Enigma's shoulders as Marvin thrashed in a fever dream. "It's just the fever. Breathe." But Marvin wasn't breathing, he was hunting. His eyes snapped open, glowing a molten, iridescent amber. In his delirium, the Enigma saw the only thing in the world that wasn't bowing to his power. He saw a pillar of strength, a scentless sanctuary. With a strength that caught Andrew off guard, Marvin surged upward. He didn't claw or strike, he wrapped his arms around Andrew's waist and pulled him onto the narrow cot, burying his face in the crook of Andrew's neck. "So quiet," Marvin groaned, his voice a jagged rasp. "Give me the silence." Andrew tried to push him back, but the physical contact was the catalyst. The moment their skin met, chest to chest, heat to heat, the Enigma's pheromones didn't just wash over Andrew, they began to sink in. It was a system restart. The sheer volume of Marvin's dominant output forced its way into Andrew's dormant glands, like a flood of electricity hitting a rusted machine. The world tilted. Andrew's vision blurred as a white-hot spike of pain shot through his scent glands, two small points behind his jaw that had never once pulsed in his life. "Marvin, stop," Andrew's voice broke. He felt the first wave of a true alpha's heat, a terrifying, oily slick of sensation he had only ever read about. In the haze of the rut, Marvin's instincts took over. He wasn't thinking about flower shops or quiet lives. He was an Enigma, and he had found an alpha who could survive him. He flipped Andrew beneath him, his movements fluid and predatory. The night became a blur of friction and fever. There was no conversation, only the sound of ragged breathing and the creak of the cot. Andrew, overwhelmed by the sudden, violent awakening of his own biology, couldn't fight the tide. When Marvin nodded him, Andrew's head hit the pillow, his eyes rolling back as his nervous system overloaded. By the time the nodding was over, the air changed. The scent of crushed pine was still there, but it was being met by something else. A ghost of a smell. A hint of citrus, sharp and bright like bergamot, and the deep, grounding bass of cedar. It was faint, barely a whisper beneath the Enigma's roar, but the dead end had been breached. As dawn began to bleed through the small, high window of the back room, the storm finally broke. Marvin collapsed into a deep, post-rut stupor, his heavy head resting on Andrew's chest. Andrew lay paralyzed, staring at the ceiling. His body felt heavy, his skin sensitive to the point of pain. But most terrifying of all was the new sensation in his nose. For the first time in his life, the world wasn't just shapes and colors. His scent felt like it was being smothered by everything around him. He could smell the stagnant water in the flower buckets in the next room. And he could smell the man on top of him, a complex, terrifyingly intimate map of pine and salt. Andrew Baltimore, the recessive alpha who wanted to be a ghost, was finally, undeniably, awake. And he absolutely hated it. Chapter 6, The Bergamot Revelation. The morning light was a jagged blade cutting through the dust motes of the back room. Andrew sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. The silence he had spent a decade cultivating was dead. In its place was a cacophony of sensory input that made his brain feel like it was being scraped with a wire brush. His senses were heightened tenfold. He could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock in the shop 3 rooms away. He could smell the stale coffee from the cafe next door, the metallic tang of the copper pipes in the walls, and, most disturbingly, the heavy, musk-laden scent of the man still sleeping behind him. Marvin stirred. The Enigma's fever had broken, leaving him depleted but conscious. He shifted, his hand instinctively reaching for the space Andrew had just vacated. When his fingers met cold sheets, his eyes snapped open. "Andrew?" Marvin's voice was a wreck, a dry rattle in his throat. Andrew didn't turn around. He was staring at a bucket of wilted baby's breath near the door. "You're awake. There's water on the counter. Drink it and leave." Marvin sat up slowly, wincing as his muscles protested. He looked at Andrew's back, those broad, alpha shoulders that seemed even more tense than usual. He opened his mouth to apologize, to thank him, to say something, but he froze. A scent hit him. It wasn't the smell of the shop. It wasn't the smell of soap or the rain outside. It was something bright, sharp, and sophisticated, like the peel of a bergamot orange crushed over a base of deep, ancient cedar. It was a scent that commanded space, a scent that carried the undeniable weight of a dominant alpha. "Andrew," Marvin whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and dawning horror. "Your scent, you're radiating." Andrew finally turned, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, concentrated fury. His gray eyes were bloodshot, and his jaw was set so tight it looked ready to crack. "Do you think I don't know that? I can smell the mold in the floorboards, Marvin. I can smell the grease on the street. I can smell you." Marvin scrambled off the cot, oblivious to his own disheveled state. He moved toward Andrew, his hand reaching out, but Andrew recoiled as if burned. "Don't," Andrew hissed. "You did this. Whatever that was, it broke something. I was at dead end, remember? I was supposed to be a ghost. Now I'm this." "It's beautiful," Marvin breathed, his Enigma instincts purring at the complexity of the bergamot and cedar. It was a perfect match for his own pine and coffee, a forest and the fruit that grew within it. "Andrew, I didn't know. I didn't think an Enigma's rut could trigger a recessive system like that. It's rare, almost unheard of. I don't care how rare it is." Andrew shouted, the sound echoing off the small walls. "I didn't want this. I wanted to be left alone. And now." He stopped, his hand going to his stomach, a flicker of true fear crossing his face. "You knotted me." The air in the room went still. Marvin's expression shifted from wonder to a profound, heavy gravity. The biological reality of an Enigma and an alpha, especially one whose system had just been rebooted by the Enigma's own pheromones, was a volatile equation. "The chances of a male alpha pregnancy are statistically negligible," Andrew said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was reciting the textbooks he'd memorized as a child to reassure himself he'd never be useful to the Baltimore legacy. "Especially for a recessive. And we aren't bonded. It won't happen." Marvin looked at Andrew, and for the first time, the predatory Enigma looked small. He looked at the man who had sheltered him when he was at his most monstrous, the man who had asked for nothing and was now paying the highest price. Instead of the relief Andrew expected, Marvin's face fell into a mask of profound sadness. He looked disappointed, almost grieving. "Is that all you think this is?" Marvin asked softly. "A biological mistake to be avoided?" "That's all it can be," Andrew replied, his voice shaking. "I'm a florist, Marvin. I'm not a mate. I'm not a true alpha. I'm just a man you broke." "Get out," Andrew added, his new scent of bergamot turning bitter and sharp with distress. "Get out before I realize I can smell the lies on you, too." Marvin stood there for a long beat, the weight of his own power feeling like a curse. He didn't want a true alpha trophy. He wanted the man who had looked at him and seen a person. Without a word, he gathered his things and walked out of the shop, leaving Andrew alone in a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly, too loud to bear. Chapter 7, The Bridge Burnt. The isolation Andrew had spent years building didn't just crack, it detonated. It started with a vibration. Not the internal, biological hum of his new pheromones, but the mechanical buzz of a phone he hadn't answered in 3 years. It sat on the floral potting bench, skittering across the wood like a frantic insect. Unknown caller. Andrew ignored it, his hands shaking as he tried to arrange a simple bundle of dried eucalyptus. His senses were still raw. Every time the shop door opened, the scent of the street, exhaust, rain-slicked asphalt, the metallic tang of the city, slapped him in the face. But the worst part was the bergamot and cedar. It clung to his skin, a constant, fragrant reminder of the night he had lost his invisibility. The phone buzzed again. Then again. Finally, he snatched it up, his voice a low, jagged growl. "I told you to leave me alone, Marvin." "Andrew? Is that you?" The voice was cold, cultured, and devoid of any warmth. It was a voice that had once told him he was a genetic dead end. It was his father, Silas Baltimore. Andrew felt the air leave his lungs. "How did you get this number?" "The biological registries flagged a massive pheromonal shift at your last known address," Silas said, sounding almost proud. "A recessive transformation into a true alpha? And linked to a Howell rut? Andrew, the family is in an uproar. Your mother is already planning a dinner. To think, all this time, you were just a late bloomer." "A late bloomer?" Andrew's laugh was a harsh, dry sound. He gripped the edge of the workbench so hard the wood groaned. "I was disowned, Silas. I was a disgrace to the bloodline. You haven't called me in a decade, and now that my biology has been forcibly rewritten, I'm suddenly worth a dinner invitation." "Don't be dramatic," his father snapped. "You've snagged an Enigma. Do you have any idea what that does for the Baltimore reputation? A true alpha bonded to a Howell, we could reclaim our seat on the council within the month. Pack your things. I'm sending a car to that little shop." "No," Andrew whispered, the scent of bergamot in the room turning sharp, acidic, and bitter. "I am not a trophy. I am not a true alpha. I am the son you threw away because I didn't smell right. Stay away from me." He slammed the phone down, but the silence didn't return. The bell chimed. Marvin was standing there, looking like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His presence was a physical pressure, the crushed pine and coffee swirling around him. But this time, it was different. Marvin looked pained. His hand was pressed against his chest, right over his heart. "Andrew, please. I can feel you. The distress, it's physically hurting me." "Get out," Andrew breathed, his head spinning. The sensory overload was peaking. The smell of his father's greed, the smell of Marvin's obsession, the smell of his own unwanted power, it was too much. "You did this. You woke them up. You gave them a reason to come back for me. I didn't want them to come back for you. I wanted you." Marvin took a step forward, his hand reaching out. "Don't touch me." Andrew roared. As he recoiled, Andrew did something he hadn't known he was capable of. He slammed his internal door. He shoved his pheromones inward, a violent, mental rejection of the bond that was trying to form. It was a psychic snap. Marvin let out a choked gasp, dropping to one knee as if he'd been struck in the solar plexus. The bond strain was a physical agony for an Enigma who had already begun to imprint. Andrew didn't stay to see him recover. He grabbed his coat, ignored the ringing phone, and ran out the back door into the rain. He didn't care about the flowers. He didn't care about the shop. He just needed to go somewhere where the air didn't smell like betrayal. Chapter 8, Sloane's Final Move. The rain didn't wash away the scent, it only made the world smell more like wet pavement and desperate choices. Andrew was gone, his shop a hollow shell of glass and greenery, but the vacuum he left behind was quickly filled by a different kind of poison. Shen sat in the plush velvet interior of his town car, scrolling through the biological registry alerts on his tablet. His face, usually a mask of pampered perfection, was twisted into something ugly. The beta Florist was a true alpha. A Baltimore. And he was carrying the residual pheromones of Marvin Howell's rut like a royal seal. He thinks he can just transition. Shen hissed to himself, the smell of lilies in the car turning sharp and fermented, like rotting fruit. He thinks he can take what belongs to me because of a lucky fluke of biology. Shen didn't go to the shop. He went to the council. By noon, a formal complaint had been filed. The accusation was pheromonal assault. Shen claimed that Andrew Baltimore, a suppressed and unstable alpha, had used his newfound strength to transitively assault an omega and manipulate an Enigma during a vulnerable rut. It was a lie, a calculated, high society assassination. If the council believed Andrew was a rogue alpha who had hidden his status to prey on others, he wouldn't just lose his shop, he'd be forcibly suppressed. Reporters and council enforcers swarmed the verdant nook by 2 o'clock. They found no Andrew, only the wilting remains of a wedding bouquet and a shattered vase of daisies. Marvin Howell, however, was already there. He stood in the center of the shop, his charcoal suit damp from the rain, his golden eyes burning with a terrifying, cold light. The bond strain from Andrew's rejection still thrummed in his chest, a dull, physical ache that made every breath feel like he was inhaling broken glass. "Mr. Howell," a council representative said, stepping over a stray stem of eucalyptus. "We have a statement from an Omega, Shen. He says the florist, Andrew, triggered a pheromonal spike that." "Shen is a liar," Marvin interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a falling mountain. The crushed pine scent flared, not in a rut frenzy, but in a deliberate, suffocating display of Enigma authority. The reporters at the door took a synchronized step back, their instincts screaming at them to flee. "Andrew Baltimore sheltered me," Marvin said, each word a strike of a hammer. "He is a man of honor who has been harassed by a system that refuses to see him as anything but a resource. If any of you, or the council, set foot near him, you will deal with the full weight of the Howell estate. And I suggest Shen starts looking for a new city. His scent is offensive." Marvin didn't wait for a response. He walked out, his heart pulling him toward the north. He didn't need a registry or a GPS. The bond, though bruised and bleeding from Andrew's rejection, was a tether. It tasted like bergamot and cedar, and it was fading. He knew where Andrew was. There was a small, derelict cabin on the Baltimore's northern property line, a place Andrew had mentioned once, in passing, as the only place he felt quiet as a child and the only place his family never touches because it is too far from the rest of the family properties. As Marvin drove, the physical pain in his chest intensified. It wasn't just the bond strain anymore. It was the realization that in trying to cherish Andrew, he had brought the very world Andrew hated right to his doorstep. He had broken the silence, and now he had to prove that he could be the one to protect the peace that remained. Chapter 9, The Forest Cabin. The cabin was a skeleton of cedar and stone, buried deep within a part of the Baltimore estate that time and prestige had forgotten. It was silent here, save for the rhythmic weeping of the rain on the rusted tin roof. But for Andrew, the silence was a lie. He was curled on the floorboards, his fingers digging into the wood. The reboot Marvin's Enigma rut had triggered was no longer a slow awakening, it was a coup. His body was a war zone. For 28 years, his alpha biology had been a dormant seed, now, it was a sprawling, thorny vine tearing through his veins. His first true alpha rut didn't feel like the flu of his recessive years. It felt like being burned alive from the inside out. The scent of bergamot and cedar wasn't just a faint note anymore. It was a thick, golden oil saturating the air of the cabin, so potent it made the moss on the stone walls seem to curl. Andrew let out a broken, guttural sound, a growl he didn't recognize. He hated it. He hated the heat, the way his skin felt too tight, and the sudden, primal urge to claim something, to tear the world apart until he found the source of the prickle that had haunted him for weeks. Then, the door creaked open. The scent of crushed pine hit the room like a physical blow. It was cool, grounding, and devastatingly familiar. Andrew. Marvin stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the gray forest. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, but the moment he breathed in the bergamot, his pupils dilated until his eyes were nothing but black voids. "Stay back," Andrew wheezed, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated the floorboards. You did this. You broke the quiet. Look at me. I'm a beast. I'm exactly what they wanted." Marvin didn't stay back. He stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind him and shutting out the world. The bond strain that had been killing him for hours began to ease the moment he entered Andrew's scent cloud. He dropped to his knees a few feet away, making himself smaller, an act of submission that an Enigma should have been biologically incapable of performing. "I am so sorry," Marvin whispered, his voice thick with a genuine, raw grief. I looked at you and I saw a miracle. I didn't see the man who just wanted to be a florist. I forced my world into yours, and I broke your peace. I was selfish, Andrew. Andrew looked up, his face flushed with the fever of the rut. I can smell your heart, Marvin. I can smell the guilt. It's making me want to. He trailed off, his teeth baring in a snarl that was half sob. I don't want to be a true alpha. I don't want to be a Baltimore. I just want the flowers to smell like flowers again. They will, Marvin promised, crawling closer until their knees touched. He didn't reach out to grab, he opened his palms, offering himself. The noise will settle. The registries, your family, Sloan. I've dealt with them. They will never touch you again. If you want to go back to being a ghost, I will buy every shadow in this city to hide you. Andrew leaned forward, his forehead dropping onto Marvin's shoulder. The contact was electric. The bergamot and pine swirled together, creating a third, new scent, something like a forest after a fire, clean and hopeful. I can't go back, Andrew admitted, his voice muffled by Marvin's coat. I can't unsmell you. I can't unfeel this. Then don't go back, Marvin murmured, his hand finally coming up to cradle the back of Andrew's neck. Go forward. With me. Not as an alpha and an enigma. Not as a trophy. Just as two men who found each other in the dark. The rut was a physical demand, but for the first time, Andrew felt the choice behind it. He turned his head, his nose brushing against Marvin's pulse point. The enigma's heart was racing, but his hands were steady. Marvin, Andrew breathed, the word a surrender. In the dim light of the cabin, as the rain turned to a soft mist outside, the beast and the enigma faded away, leaving only Andrew and Marvin to face the heat together. Chapter 10, The Unbreakable Bond. The morning sun hit the storefront of the verdant nook with a soft, golden clarity that no longer felt like a sensory assault. Inside, the shop smelled of damp moss, fresh-cut eucalyptus, and the faint, comforting bitterness of the espresso machine next door. Andrew Baltimore moved behind the counter with a grace that was no longer a ghost's invisibility, but a lion's ease. His shoulders were still broad, his jaw still sharp, but there was a light in his gray eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He reached for a bundle of dried lavender, his movement steady. His scent, bergamot and cedar, had settled from a roaring fire into a warm, lingering hum. It was the scent of a man who was finally comfortable in his own skin. The bell above the door chimed. Andrew didn't need to look up to know who it was. The static on his skin had long since transformed into a warm, humming tether that pulled gently at his chest. You're late with the coffee, Andrew said, a trace of a smile tugging at his lips. Marvin Howell stepped up to the counter, looking far less like a predatory enigma and more like a man who had finally found home. He set 2 cups down, black for himself, and a honey latte for Andrew. Marvin's scent of crushed pine and coffee wrapped around Andrew's citrus notes like a protective cloak. The barista was asking about the mystery florist again, Marvin murmured, leaning over the counter. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of Andrew's hand. Apparently, the neighborhood is convinced you're some kind of reclusive prince. I'm just a man who sells roses, Marvin, Andrew replied, interlacing their fingers. Let them have their stories. The world outside had tried to claim them. The Baltimores had sent 3 more lawyers before finally realizing that Andrew would rather burn his inheritance than return to a family that measured his worth in pheromones. Shen had vanished into the social obscurity Marvin had promised. The council had stopped calling. In the end, the true alpha transformation hadn't been a bridge to high society, it had been a bridge to a life Andrew chose for himself. Are you ready? Marvin asked softly. Tonight was the night. They had lived together for months, navigating the complexities of their bonded biology with a patience that defied their secondary genders. But tonight, they were going back to the cabin. Not to hide from a rut or a scandal, but to finalize the bond, to seal the choice they had made in the rain. Andrew looked around his shop. He looked at the flowers that no longer overwhelmed him, but spoke to him in a language of color and scent. He looked at the man who had seen his defect as a sanctuary and his awakening as a responsibility. "I've been ready since the day you bought every rose in the shop," Andrew admitted. Marvin pulled Andrew's hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles. The bond between them hummed, a deep, resonant chord that had nothing to do with the biology Andrew once feared. It was a choice made in the silence and kept in the noise. As they closed the shop and turned the sign to closed, Andrew caught his reflection in the glass. He wasn't a dead end anymore. He wasn't a true alpha trophy. He was Andrew. And as he walked out into the cool evening air, hand in hand with the Enigma who had broken his world only to help him build a better one, he realized that the silence hadn't been shattered, it had just finally found its harmony. Thank you for listening under the same moon. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here. Good night.